Miss Tara actually recently observed that I do a lot of teaching from the New Testament and asked about that. And we had a great discussion, and it's really kind of ironic that I quote so much and teach so much from the New because like 90% of my study is in the Old Testament. So actually, as I was studying a passage, some very New Testament things popped in, some great connections, and so I kind of wanted to work through some of that with everybody. I've preached out of the New Testament passage before at Music City, but I've learned some new things on the topic. I'm very excited. So we're going to start in 1 Peter chapter 1, and as you're turning, I'm going to talk very, very briefly about biblical structure, okay? So we know we have the Old and the New Testament. The Old Testament is divided into 3 types of books. You've got the books of Moses, the Torah, or the Pentateuch. Then you have the prophets, which is usually considered to be from Joshua through, I think, Kings and maybe even Chronicles, and then you skip over to the actual prophets, right? And then you have the writings, which are Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, right? And they're more of the poetry of the Bible, okay? Our New Testament actually has a very similar structure. You have the Gospels, which is the story of Christ, where we see the foundation of salvation and the work of essentially the church being planted, even though we don't actually see the churches themselves come until Acts. So then you see the work of the church afterwards, which is more akin to like the prophets. And then you have the epistles. Okay? And so today we're going to connect a New Testament command with an Old Testament command, specifically found in the Torah. And then we're going, which is our foundation of pretty much the whole Bible. And then we're going to bring it full circle with actually a revelation from one of the prophets. So if you're keeping track, we've got a lot of 3s going on. We've got 3 parts of the Old Testament, 3 parts of the New Testament, and then 3 areas of this specific command. So 1 Peter chapter 1, Peter opens his letter with the general things you'd expect in a letter. He introduces himself, addresses the audience, gives a praise to God, and then speaks of our spiritual inheritance. Then he goes on to discuss the trying of faith and our relationship to Christ. In verse 10, he begins to speak of how the Old Testament prophesied of coming salvation. And then in verse 13, which is where we're going to start, he begins to give instruction. So verses 13 to 21 is going to be our opening text, and he says, "Wherefore, gird up the loins of your mind, be sober and hope to the end for the grace that is to be brought unto you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, not fashioning yourselves according to the former lusts in your ignorance. But as he which hath called you is holy, so be ye holy in all manner of conversation. Because it is written, Be ye holy, for I am holy. And if ye call on the Father, who without respect of persons judgeth according to every man's work, pass the time of your sojourning here in fear. For as much as ye know that ye were not redeemed with corruptible things, as silver and gold, from your vain conversation received by tradition from your fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot, who verily was foreordained because of before the foundation of the world, but was manifest in these last times for you, who by him do believe in God, that raised him up from the dead and gave him glory, that your faith and hope might be in God." So he starts off these instructions with this term, gird up the loins of your mind. And I always think of that as like pull up your mental bootstraps, right? Get ready, we're going to think, we're going to dive in here. And then he gives some instruction about being sober and being serious about this. Hope to the end for grace, be obedient, a couple different things. And then he comes in verse 15 and 16. It says, "But as he which hath called you is holy, so be ye holy in all manner of conversation. Because it is written," and that's our key here, "Be ye holy, for I am holy." So that's what we're going to look at today, is what does "be ye holy, for I am holy" mean? And it says in verse 16, it is written. So I want to ask, does anyone happen to know where it is written, "Be holy, for I am holy"?
Probably Leviticus.
It is Leviticus. So that leaves us about 20 some odd chapters to guess from. Any thoughts? Does anyone have a reference in their Bible?
No.
All right. It is Leviticus 19 and 20. Okay? Now the interesting thing, if you...
Chapters 19?
Chapters 19 and 20. And there's a key for why that it's 3 there, or both chapters. The interesting thing about these chapters is, on my phone Bible, there's a heading at chapter 19 that says General Statutes. And then in my
What verse?
It's the whole chapter. So
Chapter 19.
just starting at the beginning of chapter 19. And so I looked at what my written Bible, not my digital one, said. And at the head of chapter 19, it says, a repetition of sundry laws. And I really think that these headings, of course, now the nice thing is the headings are not inspired, okay? That's what men have said, this is what this is about. They don't do justice to what's in these two chapters. And if you look at chapter 21, it starts a whole new section, okay? These statutes are anything other than general. In fact, there is a yearly cycle. If you're just wanting to study the books of Moses for a year, spend a little bit of time every day, the schedule that is the most common puts Leviticus 19 and 20 together for the study of 1 week, okay? It's broken up into weekly portions. And that cycle in an actual Torah study is designated as holiness. And there's a reason for that, because these commands are marked by God commanding Israel to, quote, be holy as he is holy. These two chapters are not only contain that command, but they're bookmarked by that command. Chapter 19 opens with it, chapter 20 closes with it. And there are 3 times that the command for us to be holy is found in these two chapters. Leviticus 19, 1 and 2, Leviticus 20, verse 7, and Leviticus 20, verse 26. Now, I'm not going to go through verse by verse every command, but I'm going to give a general outline of what is found in these commands. But I want us to focus on what the commands are, like the gist of them, and I want us to see how we, and I say we as a culture, often go against these commands. Because God starts this chapter 19 saying, be holy as I'm holy, gives a list of commands, drops a nice command to be holy as he is holy in the middle, and then ends the chapter 20 with be holy as I am holy, okay? And I would encourage you to go through these as a family. Some of these I'm going to very much gloss over because we have little ears in here, and there's some pretty graphic things. So, chapter 19, verse 1, and the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, speak unto all the congregation of the children of Israel, and say unto them, ye shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. In verse 3, he starts listing the commands. We see a command first and foremost to honor your parents and keep God's Sabbaths. Today we see rampant rebellion, disregard for authority amongst teens and kids, and even young adults, and a lack of prioritizing of church, Bible study, and rest, which are all parts of a historical Sabbath. People don't take time off. They don't prioritize church. You might find someone who might open their Bible at church or once a week at home, contrary to what God says is holy. Verse 4 deals with idolatry. Definition of idolatry is anything that exalts itself above God as an idol, and today's generation is marked by humanism. What makes me feel good? What makes me happy? It's a beautiful day, I'm going to go out on the boat instead of being at church. It's a beautiful day, I'm going to go, the game, Titans are playing at home, I'm going to go to the game, and the times conflict. Just like Pastor Dan said, they'd rather be at a baseball game than in church. Things that promote me become an idol when they supersede my relationship with God. Verses 5 through 8 deal with free will offerings and how they're to be used. Not much correlation because we obviously don't actually sacrifice anymore. Verses 9 and 10 deal with giving to the poor. And capitalism, the American dream, says that we should take everything we can and take it to the bank and keep it all for ourselves. And the people who are poor, they don't need help. They need to get up and get a job. Now, some of that, there's truth, but we have it. Pastor Dan is big on balance. When you get out of balance with that and you stop helping people, that's not consistent with what God says is holiness. And James says pure religion undefiled is to care for the widows and orphans, those who are in greatest need of help. Verses 11 through 13 deal with honesty, yet we see society becoming increasingly less trustworthy. You're actually told to lie if it benefits you. You're told you should present false images of yourself. I read a book today that talked about this guy who was a Bible teacher in Indonesia. And he had a multiple choice quiz. And he had kids turn in quizzes with blank spots. And he goes, you should guess. And they said, but Pastor, what if I got it right? He said, well, then you get a good grade. He said, yeah, but that's a dishonest representation of my knowledge.
Wow.
And I was like, oh my gosh, that's convicting.
Guess it, just hoping to get it right.
Exactly. But to them, that's lying. We're like, get the best grade you can. But there, folks, is honesty. And that's just one symptom of dishonesty and untrustworthiness in our society. Verse 14 actually deals with being kind to the disabled and not mistreating them. I would say society's doing okay on this one. We're seeing more and more push to recognize people who are struggling with disability. And I'm not going to go into the mental disabilities, things that aren't disabilities like transgenderism. I'm talking about we've got a lot of stuff going for autistic kids. We see a lot of push to help people who are blind, to ADA compliance, these things like that. So I think society's actually working on that one, but that's the exception, not the rule. Verse 15 deals with fairness in judgment, and I think we can all agree that our justice system does not treat everyone fairly.
Nope.
Verse 16 is a warning against gossip, something that is rampant not just in the world but in churches. 17 to 18 deals with holding grudges and ill feelings toward people. Another thing that we see, people being told you should cut them out of your lives, never deal with them again, and never get over your anger. Verse 19 deals with keeping the separation of various things and not allowing them to mix, which the term sanctification is synonymous with separation. Verses 20 to 22 deals with having marital relations with a slave, bondwoman, or someone who happens to be engaged. And I think if we were to do a brief examination of Civil War history, we would know that America has been not very adherent to that command. Verses 23 to 25 deal with planting a tree and eating its fruit. We don't usually pay attention to this on the time frame and the giving the first ones to God on that. We just okay, we got fruit, let's eat it. Verse 26 deals with eating bloody food. This is actually reiterated in Acts 15 as a command to New Testament Christians. And yet, I know many Christians who love a good rare steak. We don't think twice about having some food in our steaks. It also warns against people who use enchantments, and Wicca and witchcraft is on the rise in the United States. And it's actually very big in England. There's the Bible actually has a quote that says, "Nor observe times." We shouldn't do that, which is a reference to astrology. And I know many Christians, and of course it's rampant across the country, of people who know and live by all the little elements of their zodiac sign.
I've heard in churches people talk about, oh, you know my zodiac said today, and I'm like, what are you talking about? You know what I mean?
I'm just that way because I'm a Sagittarius.
Yeah.
I don't care.
I'm like,
It's not, and it's not just that we shouldn't care, because this isn't something that's funnier.
you know what that is though?
It's an affront to God's holiness.
But it's also no discipleship.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
they've not been discipled, or they don't want to learn. It could be two or the other.
Yeah.
But it's rampant, and a lot of people are involved in that. And I mean, I see it in the workplace all the time. It's a shame. But anyway, they put their hope in that.
Yeah, exactly. And God says, don't do it. And it is an affront to His holiness.
Yeah, grab something like
Yeah.
that.
28, you shall not make any cuttings in your
Yeah.
flesh for the dead.
So that's actually-
any marks upon you. I am the Lord.
27 and 28 deal with forms of pagan worship. And those were things that were very big in pagan idolatry and temple worship. And many of these have become socially acceptable today. Verse 29 deals with prostituting your daughter. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but the exploitation of minors is at an all-time high in the U.S. Verse 30 goes and kind of goes back to keeping the Sabbath and reverencing the sanctuary of God. Jesus had to deal with this when He said, "You've turned my house into a den of thieves." And I think there is a great irreverence for the nature of what the church is supposed to be inside the church today. Verse 31 deals with those who keep the company of familiar spirits. Pastor Dan, I know I would equate that to ghosts, and I know you've had some experience with the spiritual realm on that. No, I'm not saying you keep company, but you've had interaction, and I know there's some other things going on there.
What?
Conversion.
Oh, good.
Oh, good.
I'm sorry.
Verse 32 talks about how we should honor God in front of the elderly. Verses 33 to 34 deal with how we should deal with foreigners in our land. Verses 35 to 37 kind of recap a few things and then reiterate just the general command of keeping God's commands. And then we get to chapter 20. Verses 1 through 5 deal with Molech worship. and
Mullet?
Moloch.
Mullet.
Moloch was a pagan idol.
I thought you said mullet.
No, not Moloch.
I was
Moloch.
gonna say Bill Ray.
Molech.
Sorry.
So the interesting thing that characterized the worship of Moloch is the sacrifice of children. And we can get into, and that's the exact note I have, and I believe it is modern day worship of Moloch, because people would sacrifice their children for prosperity, have a better crop, for whatever reason. And we see a lot of these same reasons that we can find associated with what they expected the idol to give as reasons that people today have an
I
abortion.
didn't want to give up my career.
Like the ancient
couldn't
people.
afford it.
Or it's
Don't
just
jump
an
in the volcano.
inconvenience
Yeah.
to,
It's
you know,
okay.
just
Yeah.
an inconvenient time.
But a lot of it
You know?
boils down to
But that comes
me.
back to humanism and
I
me.
don't want to give up
which is
my
an idol.
prosperity for a child.
Right,
And so I think we need to be cautious with that and how we deal with people with that. But we see rampantly in our society something that goes very contrary to not just the Word of God, but the holiness of God. Verse 6 goes back and talking about familiar spirits again and ghosts. And then in verse 7 and 8, we see our second be holy. And this is chapter 20, where he then says, "Sanctify yourselves," or separate yourselves, "therefore, and be ye holy, for I am the Lord your God, and ye shall keep my statutes and do them. I am the Lord which sanctify you." And then verse 9, he goes right back into honoring your parents. Verses 10 through 21 deals with sins of a sexual nature. And this is huge today. There is so much information about who people are attracted to, and they're making this an identity issue when it's not. And again, this falls into the two chapters that deal with specifically the holiness of God and how we are to be holy as he is holy. And then verses 22 to 24 deal with being different from the worldly nations. And so God called Israel out to be a peculiar people. He said, "Come out from among them, be ye separate." We as Christians are called to be separate. And we see this reiterated, that there's things that the world does that we need to be different in. And people need to be able to look at us and say, those are Christians. Those are people that serve God. Verse 25 deals with eating things that are unclean. Many of these we like to look at and say they're cultural, but again, these fall into the segue of what God says is holy. And then verse 26 gives us our final be holy, and he says, I had copy still on that. "And ye shall be holy unto me, for I the Lord am holy, and have severed you from other people, that ye should be mine." And when we take on the blood of Christ as our righteousness, we are his. We belong to him. He says we've been bought with a price, and we're not our own. And so we need to understand that what is of God and what is an affront to God should be an affront to us. And then verse 27, the closing of the chapter, is our final warning on familiar spirits and wizardry. And wizardry specifically deals with necromancy and conversations with the dead, things like that. And we see a lot of that even in churches. We see it in Catholicism, where they pray to the saints. And they'll say, well, we're not praying to them, we're venerating. And they change the wording to make it seem okay, but then you're like, do you talk to them? Yeah. Are you asking them for things? Yes. Okay, you're praying to them. By definition, you are praying to a dead person, and that's unbiblical. And it's not just unbiblical, it's, again, an affront to the holiness of God.
It's illogical.
Yeah.
Dead person can't hear
And so we see
They're in heaven, they don't care.
you. Even if they
They're
can't
like,
hear
hey, I'm in a better place. You know?
Hey, quit bugging me. He's
So
done right now.
we
got
see the command that Peter gave, and we see basically when he says, all right, gird up the loins of your mind, pull up your mental bootstraps, we're going to think, we're going to dig deep. Here's this command. We're going to, he's basically referencing the entire church back to these two chapters and saying, when God says, be holy as I'm holy, and I'm telling you to continue this command in the church, here's the structure of that. Without having to go and type out and write out on very expensive paper back then the whole list of things that are holy and unholy, he says, hey, go check your Bibles. This is what this means, okay? And then we see something really cool. So we talked about how the Old Testament's divided into three types of books. The New Testament's divided into three types of books. And we talked about how God gave in those two chapters 3 commands to be holy. So let's look at the prophets. This is our third tie-in. Isaiah chapter 6. This is so powerful. I thought it was when I made the connection anyway. Hopefully you guys think it is too. Isaiah chapter 6, we're going to start right in verse 1. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw also the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. Above it stood the seraphims. Each one had 6 wings. With twain he covered his face, with twain he covered his feet, and with twain he did fly. And one cried unto another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. 3 holies. In one verse, Isaiah made the entire connection of 2 chapters of law. And if you understand the nature of the tabernacle given to Moses, God actually gave Moses the command. He said, build this as you see it. And that's really the command that we see, okay? And if you study out the layout of the camp, you see the temples here, and then you have, that's our timer. You have around it the Levites providing protection.
Whoa.
Then you have the actual 12 tribes of Israel. I'm going to wrap this up really fast. You have the actual 12 tribes of Israel placed around the camp of Levi. And there are 4 tribes that are given kind of the leadership of each quadrant, right? And so to the east you have Judah, to the south you have Reuben, to the west was, I think, Dan, and to the north was Manasseh. These were the ones that were in charge. And you look at, if you study out the symbols of what was like the mascot of each of those 4 tribes, you'll see a lion, a bear, an eagle, and a man, I think, were the order. And then you study when Isaiah gets, and he talks about these weird creatures and that have these 4 faces. He says on the right, to the east, was a lion. To the south was a bear for strength. And then you'll find that it's usually either an eagle or a serpent and a man. And then you go into Revelation, and John sees the same thing. And we see that what Isaiah is seeing here is the same thing that Moses saw. It's the actual temple of God in heaven. And that everything that God gave Moses at Mount Sinai was to be a earthly representation of the heavenly temple. And so when Isaiah says, I saw the Lord and he was holy, 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 he's saying that these 2 chapters were so powerfully entrenched in his heart and mind that the angels proclaim, holy, 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 and God tells us, be holy, holy, holy. And so we see this great circle here, and I love, if we continue reading very briefly, verse 6 of Isaiah chapter 6, he says, let's go verse 5. Then said I, woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. So we see that Isaiah sees the holiness of God and realizes in his humanity he's unclean, he's not worthy to be there, and he's full of sin. And verse 6 says, Then flew one of the seraphims unto me, having a live coal in his hand, which he had taken off the with tongs from off the altar, and laid it upon my mouth, and said, Lo, this hath touched thy lips, and thine iniquity is taken away, and thy sin purged. And my first thought when I read that was, what a picture of Christ. Isaiah on his own could not stand the holiness of God. But something came from heaven, touched him physically, and cleansed his sin. And if we go back to 1 Peter, we're going to bring this as a full circle, you see that Peter says that because we are in Christ, because he has made our atonement, he has purged our sin, we are to be holy as God is holy. It's without him, we can't do it. We're going to be trapped in our old ways, our old sins, of the ways of the world. But because of him, not only are we supposed to, but we can. And so that's the challenge today, is for us to, I think, take a little bit more time and study what does it mean to be holy as God is holy. And so I challenge you, go through Leviticus 19 and 20, because I think it's still relevant for us today. I think it's a great image of so many cultural things that the world says, yeah, that's great, go for it, have at it. And God says, no, that's not for you. And we're not average people. We are children of the King of Kings. And we are to live as royalty. So when God says, hey, that's unclean, that's not for you. That's not for a prince. That's not for someone that I've sanctified and saved and made clean from those things. Don't Don't be like the pig that got a bath and went right back to the mud. Be holy, be clean. Because he's got something awesome for us. He wants to give us an abundant life, but if we're continuing in sin so that grace can abound, we're going to struggle through life. Paul said, God forbid, how do we who are dead to sin live any longer therein? We're to be like Christ and live victoriously in this world. But it starts with obeying God.
Amen.